Hello, this is Elizabeth Unit 3. This focuses on troubles at home and abroad. So what you should already have done is focus on some of the problems at home, particularly the ones surrounding religion. So you should already know all about plots, and you should also know about Elizabeth's religious settlement and how that made both Catholics and Puritans react. What we're going to focus on in today's session is going to have a little bit of a look at Mary Queen of Scots. You'll already have been introduced to her own religious matters, and we're going to have a look at conflict with Spain and obviously the Armada. Just like with all our Elizabeth work, you'll have your big A3 sheets. You need to make sure that you get those out your folder and have them ready and to hand. We're going to be focusing on the ones that are on Mary Queen of Scots and the ones on problems abroad and conflict with Spain. Anything that's in red isn't already on the sheets. You might want to add it onto the back or use a post-it to add some extra notes. So we're going to start today on this side here looking at Mary Queen of Scots. So this is where we need to begin our focus today, and then we'll be using the whole of this sheet here, the one that's on Spain. So make sure you have them ready to hand, you've got your pen, you've got some post-its, maybe a red pen as well. Something you might want to do, either as you're watching this video or at the end, you might want to make a revision clock on problems abroad. So I've provided you here with the 12 headings that you could have for your different areas of your clock. So who was Mary Queen of Scots? Well, she was Elizabeth's Catholic cousin. So she was born in 1542, so very similar age to Elizabeth, just a few years younger, and she became Queen of Scotland when she was only 6 days old. She was then married off to the heir of the French throne, Francis II, in 1558, and was briefly the ruler of both Scotland and France. However, she returned to Scotland in 1561 after her husband's death, not long after Elizabeth became Queen of England in 1558. However, she returned to Scotland at a time when Scotland was becoming increasingly Protestant. And what this meant was that she wasn't popular in her own land. She was also seen as a little bit of a stranger. And she was seen as a stranger because she'd lived most of her life in France. She wasn't seen as someone who was Scottish, and therefore she wasn't welcome to the hearts of the Scottish people, particularly as they were going through that religious transformation. In 1567, she'd been accused of the murder of her second husband, Lord Darnley, and then married his potential murderer, the Earl of Bothwell. That led to a huge amount of scandal, accusations of murder, and in order to flee a trial, Mary ended up coming to England. As part of that fleeing to England, she had to abdicate and give up her Scottish throne to her young son James, and he was crowned as King of Scotland in her place. So she was now someone with no place to go. She knew she couldn't return to Scotland or she may face trial and arrest, and so when she arrived in England, she also couldn't move freely because it was dangerous for Elizabeth to have Mary in the country. So she was placed under house arrest by Elizabeth. She lived in captivity for the full 19 years that she lived in England and was never granted her freedom. She was involved both directly and indirectly in many Catholic plots, and we're going to have a look at that today. She never met Elizabeth. They didn't really have a relationship. It was just a strained relationship where Mary was in the country and became the figurehead for people who wanted to plot against Elizabeth because of her Protestant religion. So why was Mary Queen of Scots a threat to Elizabeth? Well, they were rivals for a number of reasons. The first one was obviously because of religion, and it was to do with the fact that Elizabeth was a Protestant, and of course that was welcomed by many in England, but certainly not by all, and Mary was a Catholic. Some English Catholics really would have preferred Mary on the throne. That way they could have their religion out in the open, it would be restored to Catholicism again, and therefore they could have their religious freedom in a way they didn't feel they had done, even under Elizabeth's friendly religious settlement. So there was that religious rivalry. Another reason why they were a rival is because Mary, by default, ending up being Elizabeth's heir. So if Elizabeth continued to refuse to marry and remain childless, Mary would become, in time, Queen of England. She was the last close relative of Elizabeth, the one that was seen to be the natural heir to the throne, and Mary was keen to assert that claim, and she never said, I don't want the throne, so she was very, very open about wanting to be the heir and wanting to be the Queen. This led to Elizabeth being deeply suspicious of her cousin. She knew that she coveted her throne, she knew that she wanted to be Queen, and therefore that suspicion between them remained. In order to kind of sort out that threat and bring Mary a little bit more under her own control, Elizabeth suggested that Mary marry Robert Dudley, who of course was someone that Elizabeth had been friends with since childhood and trusted implicitly. This would allow her to control Mary. However, when Mary returned to Scotland, she married Lord Darnley. Now this was very, very threatening to Elizabeth because he was also descended from King Henry VII. And what that did was that strengthened Mary's claim to the throne. And in fact, some would say it made her have a stronger claim even than Elizabeth herself. This made Elizabeth absolutely furious. So we've got these three reasons why Mary is such a threat to Elizabeth. It's that challenge of religion, it's the fact that Mary was the direct heir, and the fact that she hadn't listened to Elizabeth and she'd married someone that had only strengthened her own claim. In the previous video, you'll have gone through all the different plots that centred around Mary Queen of Scots, starting with the Northern Rebellion in 1569 and building all the way up to the Babington plot of 1586. It's really important that if you haven't looked at that already, you pause this video now and go back to part 1 and look at the problems at home. Otherwise, you won't fully understand what happens here with Mary Queen of Scots. So, the execution. Well, in October 1586, as a result of the evidence that Walsingham had found in the Babington plot, Mary was put on trial. Now, Walsingham had been absolutely determined to find some damning evidence on Mary since the Throckmorton plot in 1583, and he'd been looking and looking for that evidence and finally found it in 1586, where there was absolutely direct evidence that Mary herself, not just involved in plots and being mentioned in plots and being the figurehead of plots, but that Mary herself was directly involved, and that the letters that she was writing to other plotters clearly showed that she wanted Elizabeth dead and wanted herself on the throne. So Mary's put on trial. Remember, this is the whole point that she'd arrived in England in the first place in 1561, was that she was trying to avoid trial in Scotland. All these years later now, she's put on trial in England. So she defended herself incredibly strongly. She criticised the fact that she'd not been allowed to see evidence against her and claimed, as she was not English, that she could not be guilty of treason. How could she commit a crime against a queen who actually was not her queen? How could she, do that? She didn't feel that was possible, and therefore she said that the whole of the trial was a bit of a sham. However, that wasn't taken seriously and she was found guilty and sentenced to death. This is where the tale becomes a little bit tricky because Elizabeth herself was really reluctant to sign Mary's death warrant. She understood that if she allowed Mary to be executed, that her enemies may have some, the ability to do the same to her. That if you kill an anointed queen, then what you're saying is that queens can be killed. There was also the problem that Elizabeth's only heir now, the son of Mary, James of Scotland, he might actually want revenge for his mother's death. But probably the most important thing that she was worried about was the reaction of foreign rulers, of Catholic powers, of France and Spain. If she was to kill Mary, that might start a war because Mary would be a martyr for their Catholic cause. They were fighting Protestantism, the Spanish in the Netherlands, the French within their own country. And as we know, we're going to look at very soon, the Spanish did declare war shortly afterwards. So Elizabeth had all of these things going. She's absolutely certain that the trial is right. She's absolutely certain that Mary was guilty, but that didn't mean that she was going to take the decision to have her executed lightly. So despite the concerns, Elizabeth did sign the death warrant on the 1st of February 1587. Do note the delay there as well. She was sentenced to death on the 25th of October. It took her to the 1st of February to sign that death warrant, but she told William Davison, her secretary, not to seal the death warrant, which would mean that it didn't really have any legality if she hadn't properly sealed it over. Her signature was just one part of that agreement to carry out the death sentence. But The death warrant was sealed by Davison without Elizabeth's permission, so we were told, and on the 8th of February, Mary Queen of Scots was beheaded. Elizabeth is said to have reacted with absolute fury, and she banished Cecil, her absolutely most important member of her Privy Council, so one she'd relied on for her entire reign up to this point, and refused to see him for 6 months. And she sent William Davison to the Tower. However, some historians have felt that this punishment of Davison, this banishment of Cecil, all of this was a bit of an act, and she wanted to show the French, the Spanish, that actually she hadn't killed an anointed queen. It was her terrible servants who had acted against her, and therefore Davison may really have been a bit of a scapegoat. So we don't really know the true story here, whether Elizabeth was really angry about the death of Mary, or whether this was a little bit of an act to get her out of trouble. Our final part of Troubles Home and Abroad is about the Spanish Armada. So we need to begin with, well, why did the Armada happen? What were both the long and the short-term causes of the Spanish trying to invade England? So there was a number of long-term reasons. The first of it was that Philip of Spain had proposed to Elizabeth. Remember that he'd been married to Elizabeth's sister Mary, and had enjoyed the power that brought him in terms of not being officially the King of England, but having power over England and power over Mary, for example, bringing her into a war with France. And he'd hoped that relationship could continue. He'd marry Elizabeth, he could influence both her religious settlement and also would be able to continue to have that influence over England. When we got into the 1560s, it became very, very obvious that a marriage between himself and Elizabeth would not take place. And that led to growing tensions between the two countries as Philip's plans were thwarted. So linked to the last one is religious reasons. One of the reasons that Philip had wanted to marry Elizabeth was so that he could influence her religion and her religious settlement. But Spain remains a strong Catholic country and England was Protestant under Elizabeth after those years of restoration of Catholicism under Mary. And in the 1580s, Elizabeth had become more and more harsh towards Catholics, as we saw in part 1 of this video, doing things like increasing the fines, clamping down on the Jesuits, all of that kind of stuff. So from really the 1570s onwards, Philip had seen her as a heretic, someone who was going against the church, going against God, and challenging what he believed to be the true religion. Also, he took the papal bull quite seriously. That was in 1570. Again, that was on part 1 of this video. And this was where the Pope had excommunicated Elizabeth, thrown her out of the church, and said that the Catholics in England and abroad should not obey her and challenge her. She was not a true queen. So Philip was keen to follow those instructions to challenge Elizabeth's rule. So they're the long-term reasons to do with Philip really feeling rejected and also wanting to come to the defence of the Catholic faith. There are also a number of short-term reasons, and some of these are linked to what we've already seen. So the first short-term reason was to do with the Netherlands. So the Netherlands had been in Spain's sphere of influence for a number of years, and Philip had been taking over areas of what we call the Low Countries, and that brought with it a number of challenges, and part of that was to do with religion. Now, we've just talked about Philip being a defender of Catholicism. Well, the Netherlands was a hotbed of Protestantism, and so there was a number of people within the Netherlands who wanted to break free of Spanish control because they were also trying to control their religion. So Elizabeth, as a Protestant queen, had been informally helping Protestant rebels in the Netherlands from 1581, when she'd been funding them to raise armies and fight against Philip. Now, that already caused a huge amount of challenge and tension with Philip because he knew that she was doing that. But this became much, much worse in 1585. So 1581 to 1585, Elizabeth is there in the background, just handing over a little bit of funds, but she's not actually physically helping the Dutch rebels. From 1585, with the Treaty of Nonsuch, she then promised military assistance of 7,000 troops to the Dutch rebels. Now remember, this is Elizabeth helping rebels against Philip as a monarch. So from this point onwards, England and Spain were formally at war. In the 1570s, there'd been some challenges, there'd been some problems between the two nations, there'd been problems with privateers, which we're going to talk about in a second, and those tensions in the Netherlands had been growing. There'd been trade wars, for example. But from this point onwards, from 1585, the Armada was pretty much inevitable because Philip could not just ignore this challenge. Linked to what I've just said there, sailors' actions and economic reasons were also another reason for the Armada. Elizabeth had been encouraging privateers, or pirates you might call them, to trade illegally with the Spanish colonies, to raid Spanish ships and to attack treasure fleets carrying gold from the Americas to Spain. So Elizabeth was absolutely encouraging and taking the spoils of English traders, English pirates, actually stealing from the Spanish, or it's taking from their trade routes in a way that was not allowed. And again, that increased tension again. And of course, the spark really was the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots. So this was the final straw for Philip. So he was already angry about the marriage, and maybe put that to one side. He was angry about the religion and how Elizabeth had begun to clamp down on Catholics within England. He was furious about what was going on in the Netherlands and that continued action from the privateers. But the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots was a step too far. He could not accept the killing of a Catholic monarch. He'd been happy to stir up trouble for Elizabeth and give Spanish support to the plots involving Mary. He would have preferred Mary to have been Queen of England because she would have been a more friendly queen towards him, being a Catholic monarch. So as mentioned on the last slide, England and Spain had been at war since the Treaty of Nonsuch in 1585, and so Philip had been building up a large fleet. He was helped in that by becoming the King of Portugal as well, and that allowed him to build up his fleet even more in amalgamating his fleet with the Portuguese fleet. And so he was putting together some quite detailed plans for war, and he intended to invade England in 1587. However, Sir Francis Drake raided Cadiz in 1587, and this delayed Philip's planned invasion by more than a year. At that raid, Drake sank 35 of Philip's ships and destroyed many supplies. It was called the singeing of the King's Beard because he got so close to Spain and actually attacking Spain itself. So this was, bad preparation because all of Philip's plans were now, kind of delayed, lots of ships, essentially irreplaceable. But he continued to prepare, and he prepared this huge fleet of 130 ships and about 2,500 guns. And he planned to meet up with the Spanish army in the Netherlands. So when they got to the Netherlands, they were going to collect about another 30,000 men who were under the command of the Duke of Parma. So this wasn't something that was a small operation. This was about collecting all of these men, all of these ships, and then going on to invade England. So the plan itself, well, this was an invincible armada. This was the biggest armada in the world, and Philip believed that it was essentially undefeatable. This was originally planned to be led by someone called Santa Cruz, who was a very experienced leader of the Navy. But after his death, they had to bring in a less experienced leader in the Duke of Medina Sidonia. So this is really down to the preparation as well. That's nobody's fault, but Santa Cruz died and left them a little bit light in terms of leadership. So then they were going to sail to Calais to meet up with the Spanish army led by the Duke of Parma, so those who were coming across from the Netherlands. The Armada could then protect Parma's men as they crossed the Channel. The Spanish troops would then land in Kent and attack and capture London. English Catholics, the plan was, would then join and help. So this was a proper invasion. This wasn't supposed to be a war at sea. This was supposed to be Philip's Armada arriving, meeting up with other parts of his army from the Netherlands in Calais, and then sailing on to Kent, landing and marching on to London. If they were going to have any kind of battle, it was to be on land, because he didn't believe that people would attack his Armada because it was so strong. So what actually happened in the Armada? This isn't actually on your revision sheet. It is on something we did together in class, but I just thought it was worth a couple of minutes just going through how it all went together before we look at why the Spanish lost. So if we have a look to start with at the beginning, so we go to number 1, So the Armada left Lisbon in Portugal and was immediately hit by storms. So we're talking about bad luck from the very beginning. When we think about the storms, we generally think about the storms that happened around England and particularly in the North Sea and set them off path, etc. Storms hit the Spanish right at the very beginning of the journey. So the Spanish, who had already been delayed by what happened with Sir Francis Drake in Cadiz in 1587, were delayed again. So 19th of June, the ships were repaired. They then set sail again, and they were sighted in Cornwall on the 29th of July. The really important thing here is then that warning beacons were lit. There was a beacon system all along the south coast, and so the message got to London very, very quickly that attack was imminent. The Armada then sailed in what it saw as an unbreakable crescent formation. This had served them well in other battles, and they felt there was nothing that could go wrong from this point. Then between the 31st of July and the 4th of August, there was a gun battle that took place. Now, this was, obviously a battle that lasted several days. Very little damage was done to the Spanish ships. So the Spanish, did incur some damage, but really this was about delay to their plan that was a problem more than anything else. The English then used the tactic of fire ships. So 8 of these ships were set on fire and drifted towards the Spanish ships. And this made them break their supposedly unbreakable crescent formation. The Spanish were now in panic because their plans had been thwarted. They had assumed they would come, they would arrive, they would meet up with their men from the Netherlands who were also delayed. It would be very easy, there wouldn't really be a battle at sea. They'd land in Kent, they'd march on to London. None of that was happening. So by the 9th of August, in disarray, the Spanish tried to sail home around Scotland. So you can see the route here at the top, all the way around there. Now, bearing in mind that their ships were built for the Mediterranean, they weren't built for these choppy waters, particularly once we get over here towards Ireland. Very, very bad conditions across the Atlantic at times, and they completely weren't ready for this. They didn't have maps to chart the waters. They were blown off course by another storm. Only 65 of the 130 ships returned to Spain. So that's what actually happened in terms of the Armada itself. So what were the factors in the Spanish defeat? Well, as we saw there when we looked at the steps of what happened in the invasion itself, weather and bad luck, of course, played its parts. So storms destroyed the Spanish fleet and delayed their return to Spain. Philip II himself even blamed the storms and said it was the Protestant winds that stopped him. Many people were killed off the coast of Ireland and Scotland when they tried to return home in the bad weather, as they got shipwrecked in those areas that were slaughtered by the locals. Food and water had run out or went off. Many of the Spanish sailors were too sick to sail, so they weren't at their best. Whereas the English, well, they could be supplied food on a daily basis. And this was a real problem. Again, this is partially because of delay as well, the delay that happened when the storms hit them as soon as they left Lisbon, as well as the delays that had happened the year before. We've also got the Duke of Medina Sidonia was inexperienced, and that's because obviously Santa Cruz had died. That was complete bad luck. It wasn't to do with bad planning from the Spanish, it was just bad luck. English tactics and technology. So often when we think about the Armada, we think the English won purely because they were lucky, purely because the weather counted against them and the Spanish had miscalculated. And of course, that's absolutely true. But the English tactics were pretty good. So even before the battle, the English had good tactics. They had that system of warning beacons that we saw on the last slide, and that raid on Cadiz was calculated, and it delayed the Spanish and made it much more difficult for them to defeat the English. Technology played a massive role here. The English ships were faster, lighter, more manoeuvrable. They had new sails known as lanteens. They were so much better than the Spanish, which were very, very old-fashioned ships, very heavy galleons. So the lighter long-range cannons, sorry, that should have a double N there, meant the English could fire whilst keeping a safe distance from the Spanish, and these could also be reloaded quickly. So, the technology in both their ships and their weaponry was much better. I know that we saw on the previous slide that actually they didn't do too much damage to the Spanish ships, but it doesn't matter. It was them holding them off and stopping them from landing that really counted. Their tactics were much more effective. They used a line of battle strategy. The ships formed a single line and formed together at the enemy. And again, that would have been incredibly intimidating. They fired broadsides, which were massive barrages of cannonballs, which could sink them. And the use of fire ships, thanks to Drake, broke the Spanish crescent formation and then sent them scuttling round the rest of the British Isles. English commanders were also extremely experienced and skilled. Drake and Hawkins were vice admirals, and Lord Effingham was able to keep them under control despite the fact they were really big personalities. He brought them together and showed them this was a team effort to kind of, save the Queen, really. Drake also commanded respect from ordinary sailors because he was someone who had already achieved a lot. So of course it was the weather, it was bad luck, it was the English tactics, but it was also to do with the Spanish tactics themselves as well. They used those slow, larger ships, their galleons. These were designed for the Mediterranean waters and could not cope with the harsh conditions of the English Channel and North Sea. So they were attacking a country that had rough seas, and they brought ships that were not really up to the job. They were also delayed at Calais as the Spanish army that had been coming from the Netherlands was not ready. Their weapons were designed for land use. Remember, they were intending to land. They were intending to march from Kent to London and take the government, but they never landed. So that was a mistake from the beginning, because most of their plans were about landing and then taking over. They weren't really expecting that battle at sea. They'd also brought too many of the wrong type of cannonballs. A really, really silly mistake. Of course, as well, we have Medina Sidonia, who was inexperienced, and maybe they should have delayed longer after the death of Santa Cruz. That was bad luck, but it was poor planning to then go ahead with someone that wasn't necessarily capable of leading the attack. And they had problems meeting up with their army from the Netherlands, and that meant that those 30,000 soldiers weren't there, waiting and ready. So pretty much every aspect of the plan was flawed. So what were the consequences? Well, this was a massive victory for Elizabeth. It proved that England was now a naval power, a major naval power, and that God was on her side. The country could not rest, however. Invasion remained a concern, and Philip quickly began planning a second attempt. There was never another successful invasion attempt, but England did remain at war with Spain until 1604, until after Elizabeth's death. So this was the beginning of a series of armadas. There was a number of armadas in the 1590s that tried to attack England, and that relationship between Elizabeth and Philip was never restored. So Philip never got close really again, and Elizabeth continued to invest in her navy. England, being a naval nation, really was born out of this period. But more than it being something that led to the building up of the navy, it was for Elizabeth at the time a huge moment of prestige and pride. As it says there on the screen, it was a huge propaganda victory. And so victory is celebrated with a number of portraits. You can see this one here, where you've got the Armada in the background, showing her being the person that is kind of really taking over the world and is incredibly important, and she's face down Philip. So the Armada had brought England together. Under the threat of foreign invasion, most Catholics, rather than saying yes, we would take up arms with Philip to defeat Elizabeth, had declared their total loyalty to Elizabeth. It made her more popular and respected as a leader, and helped boost the idea of this golden age. Remember, we looked at that in part 2 of this unit, where we were looking at the culture, the theatre, all of that stuff that was improving at this time. This was a part of that, another sign that England was becoming a great nation. This is a timeline of some of the key dates of Troubles Home and Abroad. So this brings together both this video and the last one, part 1 of Troubles at Home. And so you've got all of the plots, all of the stuff to do with the Armada as well. So make sure you're aware of the timeline and how it works and how it all fits together. Do make sure you also test your knowledge. It's really important that, as well as making sure you've got things like revision clocks or flashcards, that you are reading through them, you're testing yourself on them, you're testing yourself on these short answer test type questions. the more of this stuff that you've got in your mind, the easier it's going to be to tackle the exam style questions. Once you feel comfortable with the content, with the knowledge, do make sure then that you have a go at some of the exam style questions. Good luck.